Australia. It's a place that sparks the imagination, isn't it? That huge place down south. You've probably got questions. We definitely did. And, well, we think we found a bit of a shortcut for you.
Yeah, we've been digging into a whole range of material, proper histories, analyses of, specific times, social changes, even how Australia fits into the bigger picture globally.
Exactly. So think of this as your rapid immersion. We're pulling out the big moments, the surprising bits, to give you a really solid feel for how Australia got to where it is today.
And honestly, the first thing that jumps out from all this is just the sheer timescale. We're not talking a few hundred years here. This story goes back, way back, tens of thousands of years with Indigenous history, right up to, well, modern Australia now.
So our mission really is to unpack those key moments, maybe find some surprising links you wouldn't expect.
Hopefully, yeah. Show how it all kind of evolved.
Okay, let's journey back, way back. We're talking Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. They've called this land home for, around 60,000 years.
Around that, yeah. It's almost impossible to really get your head around that kind of time depth.
What does that tell us, though? Such a long time.
Well, it points to an incredibly deep, really enduring connection to the land itself. The sources all talk about this long, long period of isolation for the continent. And that's what led to, the unique plants and animals, the whole ecosystem.
Right. And that isolation must have made it tough for anyone else trying to get there early on.
Incredibly challenging, yeah. The environment, the geography, it was just completely unfamiliar territory for outsiders. Early colonization just wasn't really feasible for a long, long time.
Okay, so fast forward to 1788, European contact. The Aboriginal population then estimated under 300,000.
That's the figure often cited, yes.
Well,
But it's crucial to understand these weren't just, scattered nomads. The sources make it really clear these were rich, complex cultures. We're talking sophisticated belief systems, incredible art, even things like earth monuments, ancient rock carvings.
wow. Sophisticated societies, then.
Absolutely, with a really profound understanding of their environment. You look at the Lake Mungo finds. They show early people with distinct physical traits. And even way back, like 41,000 years ago, you see evidence of settled communities, especially on the coast, and practices like fire stick farming.
Fire stick farming, what's that?
It's a way of managing the land using fire, encouraging certain plants, clearing undergrowth. It shows this amazing ecological knowledge long before Europeans had any clue about the continent.
And up north, in the Torres Strait, different cultures again.
Distinctly different, yes. Very connected to the sea, obviously. That shaped everything. Their social structures, navigation, their art forms too, weaving, dance. Really unique.
Resilient cultures, clearly.
Extremely adaptable, thriving in those island environments for thousands of years.
Okay, let's jump forward quite a bit now through those millennia to the Europeans showing up. It's easy to think just of Captain Cook, but you mentioned earlier hints.
Yep.
Magellan, maybe? 1522?
Yeah, there were these early sort of whispers, vague ideas in Europe about a great southern landmass, Terra Australis, to balance out the north. Sebastio Cabral claimed it for Portugal in 1570, but nothing really came of it. Portugal wasn't that interested, it seems.
So who was interested then?
The Dutch. Definitely the Dutch. Driven by trade, the Dutch East India Company, they started bumping into the coastline in the 1600s.
Right, the Doifkin in 1616.
Yeah.
Roman Jans. He actually landed, didn't he? Named places.
He did. Encountered Aboriginal people named Great Sandy Bay. Later, Tasman charted part of Tasmania, calling it Van Diemen's Land. So bits of the map were getting filled in.
But it was Britain that really went for it. Why them? Why them?
Cook's voyage in 1770, that was the game changer for the British. His detailed mapping, especially of the East Coast.
The Endeavour.
The Endeavour, yes, and later the Resolution and Discovery. His claim at Botany Bay on April 29th, 1770, that was the basis for the British saying, right, this is ours.
And those first encounters, not always friendly.
Often not, no. The sources are pretty clear misunderstandings, violence. It really set a tragic tone for what was coming.
Which brings us straight to 1788. The first fleet, Captain Arthur Phillip. Not Botany Bay in the end, but Sydney Cove.
That's right. They found Botany Bay wasn't quite right, so they moved north a bit to Port Jackson, which became Sydney.
And its first job, a penal colony, quite the origin story.
It is. The immediate purpose was practical for Britain somewhere to send convicts after losing the American colonies. But it didn't stay just a penal colony for long. It expanded quickly. Van Diemen's Land, which is now Tasmania, then settlements that became Queensland, South Australia.
And the impact on the indigenous people living there.
Immediate, devastating. Disease was a massive factor, things like smallpox that they had no immunity to, plus losing their land, direct conflict. The sources mention how Aboriginal people basically vanished from the immediate Sydney area within just a few years, despite, having lived there for millennia.
That story you mentioned, convicts seeing Aboriginal people fishing, and then suddenly the Europeans build things and they just can't get to the shore anymore.
Exactly. It's a stark picture of that rapid, irreversible displacement, just cut off from their entire way of life.
Were there any attempts to deal fairly? I think the Port Phillip Association tried to buy land.
There were isolated attempts like that, yes. But the sources suggest the general attitude was, well, pretty dismissive of Indigenous rights, cavalier even. Violence by colonists wasn't uncommon.
And people just pushed inland, like the overlanders.
Yeah, particularly sheep farmers. Coming across from Van Diemen's Land, pushing into what's now Victoria, even before Melbourne was officially settled. People like the Mackay brothers, the sources mention them just, ignoring Aboriginal claims to the land completely, taking what they wanted for grazing.
Okay, so this pattern is established. Then, boom, gold, 1851.
Everything changes, yeah. New South Wales, then Victoria. Suddenly, Australia isn't just some remote outpost, it's the place to be, land of opportunity.
Gold fever. The sources really capture that frenzy. How did that sudden rush reshape things?
Oh, massively, and so quickly. News spread like wildfire. Menimity's find, Wyberley's discovery, international news. Americans were apparently some of the first to arrive in numbers. It triggered this huge wave of immigration. People flooded in. From Britain, Ireland, Europe, America, China, chasing gold.
And this wasn't the first immigration push, right? There were earlier schemes?
No, there were earlier ones, like assisted passages, mainly from the British Isles. Important, but smaller scale. The gold rush was different. The sheer numbers, maybe 500,000 people in just 20 years or so, and much more diverse. It dramatically shifted the population mix.
So that's a third big wave, and there were more later, post-war.
Definitely. Post-World War II was huge. Lots of people from war-torn Europe, Italians, Greeks, Poles, Germans, Dutch, Hungarians. That's when Australia really starts looking properly multicultural. Later still, people from Vietnam, Indonesia, other parts of Asia. Though the sources also mention pushback sometimes, anti-immigrant feelings, and restrictive laws popping up over time.
And economically, gold obviously boosted things. But what about more recently? I saw mention of the China boom around 2008.
Yeah, the demand for Australian resources, iron ore, coal, from China especially, drove really strong growth for a while, big money. But the sources also flagged the downsides. Skill shortages in other areas, cost of living going up, and a kind of two-speed economy, mining booming. But other sectors may be struggling or not seeing the same wage growth. Concerns about competitiveness, too.
Right. Okay, so you have these separate colonies, booming, diversifying. How did they actually come together? Federation, 1901.
It was the culmination of, well, a century of these colonies developing somewhat separately, but also increasingly seeing themselves as Australian.
What drove that? Why federate?
The mix of things, it seems, a growing sense of shared identity, definitely, a desire for more control over their own affairs, less interference, fewer taxes from London, self-determination.
Still connected to Britain.
Oh, yeah. There was still a strong tie to the empire. Some sources even suggest Australia had its own sort of imperial ambitions in the Pacific region. It wasn't just about breaking away.
Interesting. So the big colonies like New South Wales, the most profitable apparently, and the farming ones like Tasmania and South Australia, the Gold States, Victoria, Queensland, they all saw benefits.
They hammered out compromises, yes. It wasn't easy. There were big constitutional conventions where they debated everything.
And legally, how did it happen?
It was actually an act of the British Parliament in London. The Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act, passed in 1900, took effect January 1st, 1901. That created the Commonwealth of Australia, based on the Westminster system, parliamentary sovereignty and all that, though some colonial structures were kept, just altered.
Okay, and then, not long after federating, the world plunges into war. World War I. Australia's in automatically.
As part of the British Empire, yes. When Britain declared war, Australia was in too. They formed the Australian Imperial Force, the AIF, mostly volunteers initially.
Volunteers, so
Yeah.
a strong sense of duty to the empire.
Seems so. There was debate about conscription. It was rejected at first, but brought in later because the casualties were just so horrific.
Gallipoli, the Western Front.
Yeah, huge losses. Gallipoli especially became this foundational moment in the Australian psyche, forging an identity separate in some ways from Britain through that shared sacrifice and loss. Women were involved too. Lots of voluntary organizations supporting the war effort.
And after the war, what did Australia look like?
There was growth in cities, but also shortages of labor on the countryside. Struggles supporting returned soldiers too. The sources mentioned welfare services weren't always great or fair. And internationally, a slow shift. Still tied to Britain, but maybe looking a bit more towards the U.S., less reliant on the League of Nations, perhaps.
Then World War II. Australia declares war itself this time.
Yes, against Germany in 1939. But initially, their capacity to contribute was a bit limited. They formed a volunteer defense corps for home defense and a second AIF for overseas.
Where did they fight?
North Africa, Greece, Crete initially. Again, heavy casualties. That led to conscription for overseas service being introduced.
But the big shift was the war in the Pacific, right? Japan.
Absolutely. That brought the war right to Australia's doorstep, metaphorically and literally with bombings in the north. The fighting in Papua New Guinea, particularly the Kokoda Track campaign against the Japanese, was brutal and absolutely critical.
A direct threat. That must have changed Australia's view of the world.
Profoundly. It really cemented the alliance with the United States, which became much more central to Australian defense thinking after the war.
Okay, post-war. The sources talk about a real boom time, 1945 to maybe the early 70s, economic growth, immigration.
Yeah, a period of pretty sustained prosperity. Different from Europe, which was rebuilding. Australia was building, expanding, manufacturing was strong. There was basically full employment for a long time.
And immigration was key again.
Huge. Those assisted passages for Brits continued, the 10-pound palms, but also, crucially, taking in large numbers of displaced people, refugees from Europe, Italians, Greeks, Poles, Yugoslavs, Germans. They set up camps like Kaima. And air travel was becoming more common. Those new Boeing 707s made the journey faster. It really accelerated the shift towards a multicultural society.
And it wasn't just the economy changing. Socially, legally, too.
Big time. It mirrored global trends, really. Old systems were collapsing everywhere. Lots of social and legal reforms happening in Australia during those decades. New ideas taking hold.
Including social movements pushing for change.
Yeah.
Like the disability rights movement.
Yes, the sources highlight that. People becoming dissatisfied with how things were, organizing. The protests at the Sydney Royal Easter Show over access, that's a really concrete example.
Direct action getting results.
It seems so. That protest led directly to changes, a show access policy. It showed that collective action could really force institutions to listen and adapt, challenging discrimination head on.
And Indigenous activism was also growing. We mentioned early protests back in 1888, 1938.
Yes, those were really significant early moments. Boycotting the centennial in 1888, the Day of Mourning in 1938, on the 150th anniversary of the First Fleet. They were protesting the ongoing repression, the loss of land, the lack of basic rights, not being able to move freely, voicing these fundamental grievances.
And that 1938 protest, contrasting with Indigenous people being forced into the official reenactments, that's powerful imagery.
It really highlights the deep injustice they felt, being asked to celebrate their own dispossession. It was a turning point in organized Indigenous political action.
Feminism, too. Roots going way back.
Late 19th, early 20th century, yeah. The fight for the vote, the suffragettes, and then ongoing efforts for equal rights in work, education, law. The women's anti-conscription movement during WWI shows they were engaged in big political debates, too, challenging norms.
Okay, let's talk modern Australia. That post-war migration really shaped the country we see now, right? Super diverse.
Incredibly so. The 2016 census figures mentioned in the sources really drive that home. A huge percentage born overseas, or with parents born overseas. So many languages spoken other than English.
Religions, too.
Yeah, growth in non-Christian faiths. It's just transformed the cultural landscape, especially in big cities like Sydney and Melbourne. They're truly global cities now.
And politically, what's the setup?
It's a constitutional monarchy, technically, with the king as head of state represented by a governor-general. But it functions as a parliamentary democracy. 6 states, 2 main territories, federal parliament in Canberra, mostly a 2-party system, the center-right coalition, center-left Labour Party. The sources note that journey from a more conservative establishment setup towards a more representative democracy over time.
Now, a huge issue for modern Australia, the environment. The sources paint a worrying picture sometimes. Rivers, reefs.
Yeah, there are significant challenges, problems with river systems like the Murray-Darling, pressure on marine environments. The Great Barrier Reef is the obvious one, but also seagrass beds, algal blooms, fisheries under pressure too.
What's causing it?
A lot links back to European settlement patterns and development. Waste, pollutants from agriculture and industry, resource extraction. And Australia has a very high per capita resource use. The sources suggest the response was slow initially, but awareness and efforts have definitely grown.
And climate change looms large over all of this.
Undeniably. The science is clear, and Australia is already seeing the impacts: more extreme heat, fires, floods, cyclones.
And the impact on indigenous communities is even worse.
Often, yes, because their culture and livelihoods are so closely tied to the land and sea. Rising sea levels threatening coastal communities in the Torres Strait, for example. Displacement is a real threat.
But they also have knowledge to contribute.
Absolutely. Thousands of years of experience adapting to environmental change. The sources stress the value of Indigenous ecological knowledge for tackling climate change and the need for real partnerships, not just consultation, proper collaboration.
There are conservation efforts, but Australia's extinction record, it's pretty bad.
It is, sadly, one of the worst in the world since European arrival. Feral animals, cats, foxes, rabbits are a huge problem. Habitat destruction from land clearing is another major factor.
Are there success stories?
There are cooperative projects, Indigenous rangers working with scientists. These are really important. But the sources mention challenges funding, coordination across different states and territories. Needs more standardization, maybe.
Okay, shifting focus outwards now. Australia on the global stage. Trade seems key, especially with Asia.
Very much so. Actively promoting trade and partnerships with neighbors. China, obviously huge, but also India, Singapore, other Southeast Asian nations. Despite, some recent diplomatic bumps in the road.
Does Australia have a strong political voice globally?
The sources suggest it's been a willing participant, a middle power, but maybe hasn't always had a consistently developed long-term global political strategy, sometimes reactive, maybe some diplomatic missteps mentioned. Building those long-term relationships is seen as crucial.
And connecting back to Indigenous issues, is that reflected globally?
There's a point made that while things are improving nationally in terms of collaboration with Indigenous Australians, more needs to happen for Australia to show real global leadership on Indigenous rights and reconciliation. Walk the talk internationally.
How has that international role evolved since Federation?
It's been a big shift. From basically a British dominion, very focused on the white Australia policy and keeping threats out, to post-WWII, dropping the white Australia policy, the ANZ-US treaty with the US and New Zealand, much more engagement with Asia, especially from the 70s onwards. The Cold War, the rise of China all reshaped its outlook.
Was Australia involved in things like setting up global trade rules?
Yeah, it played a role in negotiating AT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. But the sources also say it was maybe a bit slow sometimes to actually implement tariff cuts itself. And early efforts to expand trade rules beyond just tariffs didn't get far initially. Early interest in a deal with New Zealand, too, but slow progress there for a while.
Okay, let's bring it right up to date. Contemporary challenges. Climate change is still top of the list.
Absolutely. The direct impacts are undeniable now. Floods, bushfires, cyclones, hitting harder more often. And again, that disproportionate impact on Indigenous communities. Segregation, sometimes forced moves because of rising seas. Their long history of adapting is often ignored by wider society or by resource industries.
Mining and resources, still a big tension point.
Huge. Land degradation, environmental damage. The sources mention things like coal mining near the Great Barrier Reef, despite all the international concern, though there was a recent Queensland court decision mentioned, recognizing traditional land management practices in one case, which might be significant.
And what about Indigenous rights more broadly, legally?
It's complex. International principles are one thing, but domestic law is what counts day to day. Australia has key legislation, like native title laws, but the sources talk about the need for more genuine power sharing, devolving legal control over land use, health policy back to Indigenous communities, moving beyond symbolic recognition towards real self-determination, maybe even dedicated political representation, like an Aboriginal electorate that's been discussed.
And economic inequality. Australia is wealthy, but is it shared fairly?
That's another major challenge highlighted. High overall wealth, yes, but significant disparity. And economic inequality often fuels social inequality. Vulnerable groups get hit hardest. Rising unemployment among people with lower education levels. The poorest seeing incomes fall while the richest get richer. High child poverty rates compared to similar countries. And relatively low government spending on social support compared to other wealthy nations.
We shouldn't forget the cultural side, though. Australia is known for arts, music.
Definitely. A rich history there. Literature, song, dance, painting. The sources mention unique birds known for their songs, like lyrebirds, the influence of immigrant traditions blending in, bush ballads and stories capturing the landscape and early life.
Those bush ballads, a sense of nostalgia.
Yeah, capturing a particular image of Australian life and landscape that resonated deeply. Poets like Banjo Patterson, Henry Lawson, their work is still iconic. Artists responding to specific
And
places.
literature.
A long tradition. Charles Harper mentioned as an early poet. Themes of landscape, unique wildlife, the colonial experience, trying to make sense of a strange new place.
Sport, too. Obviously huge in Australia.
Massively. Strong British and Irish roots, cricket, rugby, soccer, but also Indigenous games existed long before. Then uniquely Australian developments like Aussie rules football. Boxing was big early on. As settlements grew, so did all sorts of recreation, water sports, local contests. It's deeply embedded.
So, wrapping up, the sources leave us with this idea about a nation's laws needing to reflect something deeper. Spiritual nature, relationships.
Yeah, it's suggesting that the foundations need to be more than just rules on paper. They need to connect with the values and experiences of the people. It criticizes a view based on ignorance and calls for more understanding.
A call for continued exploration, really, not just physically but intellectually to get the complexities.
Exactly. It's a reminder that you can't understand a nation like Australia with simple answers. You have to keep digging into its history, its different cultures, how it keeps changing.
So looking back on this deep dive, we've covered an immense span. Ancient indigenous connections, European arrival, gold rushes, nation-building, wars, massive migration, modern diversity, environmental pressures. It's quite a story.
It really is. And what strikes me is how the deep past constantly echoes in the present. That tension between the ancient land and modern development, between isolation and global connection, it's always there.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, listening. How does this complex history think about the deep indigenous heritage alongside resource exploitation, the celebration of multiculturalism alongside ongoing inequality? How does all that continue to play out in Australia today and shape its future? What part of this story resonates most as you think about where Australia is heading? Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of Australian history.